trail and ultra runners, what is going on? Welcome to another episode of the KoopCast. As always, I am your host, Coach Jason Koop, and this episode of the podcast is about a phenomenon that tends to pop up in the headlines every few years, and that is overtraining syndrome, underperformance syndrome, and the whole host of other descriptive words that we use to describe when athletes start underperforming for whatever reason or reasons. So on the podcast today, please welcome Sophie Herzog, who is the owner, co-founder, and primary performance analyst at the MRYA Center for Athlete Development. At the MRYA Center for Athlete Development, she is responsible for deploying a host of specialists to help monitor and counsel athletes that are at risk or in the throes of underperformance syndrome. Also on the podcast today, we bring on CTS coach Ryan Anderson to provide his professional input on how he helps manage this process with his athletes. All right, folks, with that intro, I am getting right out of the way. Here's my interview with Sophie Herzog, all about underperformance syndrome and how we can help manage it as athletes and coaches. All right, Sophie, well, welcome to the podcast. I appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
I was thinking about this recording earlier today, and it brought me back to one of the very first recordings that I did with one of my colleagues and friends, Corinne Malcolm, on overtraining syndrome. And at the time, it was and this is still the case, it was an extremely hot topic in the ultramarathon world. And you know how the media cycle kind of plays out with these, with the various buzzwords. Overtraining syndrome, underperformance syndrome, whatever we want to call it, and we're going to get into some of the vocabulary, got its foothold within the community, and all of a sudden everybody has self-diagnosed or diagnosed others from afar with overtraining syndrome. We're going to talk a little bit about that, but I just thought it was interesting. This is like all coming almost back full circle. 3 years ago when I very first started the podcast, we're now kind of talking about the same topic, but I think we're going to put a little bit of a different lens on it. But before we get into that, so the listeners can know you just a little bit better, why don't you give everybody just a background of who you are and how you got into sport?
Yeah, it's really interesting what you're saying, like in terms of the topics coming back. But yeah, we'll touch on that later. I guess from myself, so my background is not in endurance sports. So I come from a football or soccer for the American listeners background. I played football here in Switzerland for Basel Football Club with the guys from early age, and super into it, like competing in the academy, and was the first girl there. And I think quite ambitious, quite put a lot of pressure on myself, and developed an eating disorder when I was like 14, and shot myself in the foot with that. And sort of that was the first rather large experience with underperformance, I would say. But and it carried on for a long time. I think I was probably at different forms of eating disorders and disordered eating for a period of about 10 years before and whilst I was actually then stopping to play football and starting with triathlon, which unfortunately I must admit also had to do with or it was definitely in my thoughts that this is a sport where you expend lots of energy, so it was not solely the decision, oh yeah, this is fun, so let's try that. I was basically thinking this is something I can be good at, and I can also expend lots of energy. With that, I was also doing a master's and then a PhD at ETH Zurich in biophysics, so also not directly related to sports science. And as you can imagine, like doing a PhD and trying to train 20 plus hours a week is not directly or necessarily a recipe for disaster, but there's definitely some time and energy constraints involved. So, that again ties back to other experiences or renewed experiences with on the performance. And that's sort of like, why this topic has such a big, had such a big impact in my life, I would say. Yeah.
Speaking of the PhD and athlete management, I've now have had three elite ultra runners who I've been coaching throughout their elite career and have gone through this being a PhD student while being an elite athlete to finishing their PhD and being an elite athlete. And I can tell you firsthand, there's a marked difference. And there definitely tends to be an apex right around when that thesis is going to be defended, where the stressors is otherwise specified. The non-training stressors that we'll get into a little bit tend to have a very abrupt peak, and it's not one that happens on one single day. There's usually a time frame that's associated with it, and I have both. I will say that I've done it pretty well, and I've also kind of screwed it up a little bit in terms of trying to load manage everything that's going on with those two different roles that those athletes play. So what I'm trying to say is your plight is something that coaches feel as well.
Yeah, and it's also like, even if you're on the other side as an athlete or as a student, I think it's not always easy to put or to analyze where you actually at. Sometimes you cope better than naturally. Like, if you look at everything objectively, you think like you should be really struggling, but for some reason like you're thriving, which maybe that's already a warning sign. Because in the end, like, you might be striving still, but there's a big fall coming, or you should be striving, and you should be really flying, because basically you have less loads than before. Like, for example, after you finish your PhD, but sometimes that that loss in pressure is a bit like after a big race. Like, you feel empty, or like that something that has been a target for so long is not there anymore. It's also not super easy to handle. So it's a very complex topic, as is on the performance, as we'll probably
Yeah.
speak about,
And
or
and
as
we're gonna
is performance as well.
right.
Both
We're gonna spend the majority of the time talking about overtraining and underperformance syndrome. But there's one kind of like last piece of table set that I want to make sure gets communicated to the listeners, and that's the work that you've done with MRYA. So can you explain to the audience first off what it is, and then specifically how you function within that organization?
Yeah, so thanks for letting me do that in the first place. And actually, maybe chronologically, it's easy to just explain a little bit. Like, so I did finish my PhD, and then I ought to have a break and just focus a little bit on my sports. And then I actually got the opportunity to work with Olaf Alexander Boo and the Norwegian triathletes, Christian Blumenfeld and Gustav Iden, and also Ken Janiner. So I jumped straight into another high performance environment opportunity. And like, it was maybe even more fast paced environment than I had before, like in my own sort of rhythm, and did that for a few months. And then only after I stopped working with them, I had this complete break or shutdown, as I said before, and I experienced severe underperformance and unexplained, as we'll talk about later. So I didn't know, why am I not performing, because I thought it's a great opportunity. Now I just focus on sports for a bit before I orient myself, and find something to work on. But the body didn't cooperate. So that's where, like, this topic of an experience that I've had several times in my life materialized, like, very, very obviously. And that's where I started having conversation with Eyvind Sombach, which I think you also had on the podcast before. And he's or was at the time a professor at the NTNU in Trondheim. but did a sabbatical in Switzerland, which is where I live, as he has a Swiss wife. And we had several conversations about this topic, and he was at the time leading several research projects where Rune Talsnes was involved, doing a really interesting case study about Dieter Tönset, so a world-class cross-country skier, which is one of the scientific frameworks that we are using now with MRYA. And MRYA was sort of, that was the original thought that we had. We want to make the sports world a better place in terms of we want to help athletes that don't have the support network, such as a Dietrich Turnset or, the athletes that are at the very top. But not just in their underperformance state, but also in terms of, how can you actually prevent it? What kind of education goes into preventing situations like that, not just for the athlete itself, but also for coaches, for development programs such as sports high schools or universities, but even for parents. So just basically providing a support environment and a sort of a holistic athlete management system that helps athletes and in their development program or in their development.
What athletes would be eligible for this? Can any athlete out there, recreational athlete, elite athlete from the US, from any other country, can they reach out to you for these resources?
Yeah, definitely. And actually, I think maybe we'll come to that later, but I think not even only athletes are eligible for it. I think it's, if you look into the corporate world, into any kind of high performance environments, the issues or the constraints that we're having and the problems that we're dealing with are very much the same. It's very much always a question of load management and kind of those two opposite forces, the load and the recovery. And in the end, you want to adapt and optimize for performance instead of breaking down. And I think that's the difficult balance to get right.
So we're going to talk about overtraining and or underperformance and the whole alphabet soup of acronyms that we've now conjured up to describe all these different phenomenons. This is going to be a timely podcast release because it's going to come out in late April, early May. A lot of athletes are staring their main events in the face. They're coming up in the next 8 to 12 weeks, and they're going to want to ramp their training up. And kind of alongside that, whenever you ramp your training up, there has to be some sort of load management component in the background, because you can't just add stress if you don't take it away from somewhere else. And many of the athletes out there that are listening to this are going to have a personal reference point with either doing too much training or doing too much too quickly, or not recovering from the training that they applied that they thought that they could actually handle. So I use that to kind of level set everybody that you're going to go through this, because ultramarathon is a challenging sport, just like any other endurance sport. We kind of want to maximize the stress that we put on our body, but we still need to do it in a really safe way. So before we start, there's this whole range of things that have been described over the years in terms of how do we actually want to describe either doing too much or not allowing the proper time and or effectiveness for the recovery process to actually take place. I'm going to let you describe the different flavors of this, of what most people would just call overtraining or overtraining syndrome, since you're the expert here. Describe the different flavors of this, and why do we need different flavors of it, or does it actually matter how we describe them?
Yeah, it's like you say, it's very confusing, and I think science is kind of known for having multiple terms to describe the same thing or sort of the same thing. And I think the term underperformance or unexplained underperformance syndrome is basically it's not a new term. It's not like a new kid on the block. I think it's more just a bit of an umbrella term, whereas other terms are maybe used to describe prolonged underperformance depending on either the severity, the duration, or the cause of the issues. Like overtraining sort of implies very much that the causative factor is the training itself. Whereas I think it's very rare that training alone is the sole causative factor. And I think that's a little bit why me personally, prefer the term underperformance syndrome. And the addition of the word syndrome, I think, kind of explains that or it kind of is emphasizes these multifactorial causes, possibly. But yeah, in a nutshell, I think what these terms all have in common is that they occur, and that's what makes it so complicated and difficult to really put a finger on it, is that they occur on a continuum, right? Like if you, for example, you do a race, then you feel extremely fatigued at the end, hopefully. So that is acute fatigue, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. However, if you then carry this fatigue into something chronic, then the further you go, the further you move across to the right on that fatigue spectrum, towards functional overreaching, which is something that you can still recover relatively quickly from, with potential beneficial adaptations. For example, in a hard training block. But then the sort of the how do you say, like the transition from this functional overreaching to non-functional overreaching, where you possibly don't have a beneficial adaptation anymore, to then something called overtraining, at least in research definitions. It's it's a continuum, but these transitions are very vaguely defined or not defined at all. And we also don't really have a proper way of diagnosing someone to say, like, you're now non-functionally overreached or you're now overtrained. It's very, very hard to do.
And I think a lot of the plight with the vocabulary has to do with that last point. We're trying to use the vocabulary, either overtraining, and I'm emphasizing the word over intentionally, the training being too much, versus under recovery, the recovery not being enough. We're trying to use those pieces of vocabulary to help give us guidelines for how to fix the ailment. Because if the training is truly over and then you remove the training, you should actually get better. And raising my hand here, the first experience I had in this arena managing this with athletes, the dominant vocabulary that we used was overtraining syndrome. This is back in the early 2000s. It's starting to, kind of emerge, or we started to describe it. And in my, kind of naive, maybe non-analytical brain, what I would think is, well, if I had an athlete that was truly overtraining and I started managing that athlete, let's just train less, right? If the training is over and you train less, then voila, there's a magic, fix to it. Turns out it's a little bit more complicated than that, and trying to figure out what is over and what is under and how to actually make the course correction isn't as black and white. But do you see athletes, and you consult with athletes, that are actually dealing with this despite all the poor vocabulary and these vague transition points as you describe them? Is there a common theme that runs between the athletes that you're working with? Meaning they're all coming in and these are the things that they are describing, and here's how we can get a better fix on how to move forward. Can you just generally describe that process as you're managing athletes that are kind of coming in the door or seeking your counsel?
That's a very good summary that you you made there. And I think, yeah, there is a common denominator, and that's like athletes are not performing. So that's again like why I think underperformance is maybe better suitable, or at least they're not consistently performing. I think what is quite common is that you have uh, quite stark or quite a stark variability in performance. So one day you might feel great, and then the other day you feel pretty rubbish again, and that's kind of like a little bit of an up and down constantly. Stagnation is another one, which is also not strictly on the performance, but like you're feeling like you're putting a lot of effort in and don't see the rewards. And I think these three things, so on the performance, performance variability, and performance stagnation, what they usually cause in athletes is that athletes do not reduce the load when they see this or experience this. They have a tendency to push harder. They oftentimes also have a tendency to maybe be a bit more extreme in terms of, whether that's intensity, volume, or actually, manipulating their diet. For instance, like thinking, okay, maybe I need to lose a few pounds here. And I think that's oftentimes what pushes them actually in the opposite direction of that overtraining or fatigue continuum. And with that, so now we're talking about physical symptoms. Obviously, there's also oftentimes, and I guess we'll talk about that later. But if you are actually monitoring subjective factors such as motivation to train or mood swings or mood in general, or other like completely non-training related factors such as stuff like sleep quality or libido, things like that, then which you could say is psychological or health related, then you see changes there as well. But these are more variable. I would say like if we're speaking about athletes, then the performance related, like on the performance stagnation and variability are the most common ones. And these often also go in line with, changes, for instance, in subjective exertion. So how hard is a certain effort if the rate of perceived exertion all of a sudden feels a lot higher, then that's kind of a warning sign as well.
Okay, so if the common denominator is performance decline and or performance variability, those two components, one of the things athletes are going to struggle with is those are lagging indicators. You don't know if you're overtrained or under recovered or whatever vocabulary we ultimately ascribe to this. You don't know that until after the fact, right? After you've already made the mistake or you're starting to make the mistake, right? You've kind of teetered over the edge or you're teetering across the blurred line, right? Instead of hard edges. I think that's a better analogy. Athletes will want to know, like, what can they do to stay out of that blurred line in the first place, right? Are there early warning signs to you might be getting closer to this blurry edge that they can then kind of step back from or at least take assessments from? And I'll kind of like preview the answer, or I'll kind of like preview a little bit of the dialogue. Is there's all sorts of monitoring that we can put on our athletes. I have a Garmin Fenix 7, which isn't even the latest Garmin on my watch right now. Every morning it gives me a card and it tells me how awesome or not awesome I'm going to be every single day. And there's an infinite number of variations of that, whether they're rooted in a wristwatch or a ring or subjective monitoring or performance monitoring or all of the above. How can athletes take an assessment of that? Athletes and coaches take an assessment of that to stay further away from this blurry line that ultimately the athletes kind of end up in your care after they've kind of like stepped over it. What can they do in advance to prevent it from happening in the first place? Okay, I wanted to sit down with Coach Ryan Anderson to see how we monitor athletes for early signs of underperformance.
So I think this all comes down to honest and consistent communication. And that's texting with the athlete, regular phone calls, and good, consistent feedback via training peaks, and the post-activity comments. And for some athletes, they are succinct. It's 2 to 3 sentences. And over time, I learned how to take so much information out of those 2 to 3 sentences. Others, it's 2 to 3 paragraphs, and naturally, you get a lot of information out of that. Either way, I don't care as long as it's consistent, because if there's not consistency in that communication, then I'm constantly having to guess or follow up and like, okay, can you tell me a little more about this? Because for some athletes, they may get in a habit of only leaving feedback when things are going well, or vice versa, when things are going bad. And of course, in both of those examples, it's only half the puzzle. And when you have the full picture, then you learn their mood. You can discern through their feedback, either way, and how things ebb and flow. But really, consistent, honest communication is the foundation with this. And data comes into play as well, whether that's tracking their performance on interval workouts, endurance runs, looking at their heart rate data, and using HRV for training as well.
Yeah, that's again a very interesting one. And I think that's something that I learned, or where I learned a lot from the Norwegian culture. And I think, or maybe you could say the Scandinavian culture, because I think what is slightly different there, especially when I compare it to my past as a football player, where I was used to just come to practice and the coach would say, "This is what we do today," and you just go there and execute. And there is zero um, ownership or responsibility of, or yeah, like of the whole program that I'm doing, like what I'm actually doing, whether I should actually push through today or not. And obviously, I was not involved in the training planning or in the training process with my football coach, um, because the training was not individualized for me. But then, even as an endurance athlete, I came to triathlon and I thought I would just need to find the perfect plan and then execute that plan, and everything was going to be fine. And I think what the best athletes have in common is that they're very intelligent in terms of when do I have to push through and when do I have to adapt and maybe do less today, um, in terms of doing more like in the long term. So having that long term thinking, over short term, or that long term gains over short term gains. And obviously, there's a lot that goes into that. You know, there's a lot of learning about yourself, and also I had to learn that you cannot develop that in just 1 year or in half a year. It takes a while to really get in tune with your body and be honest with yourself. And I think that's obviously where a coach can be extremely helpful, like a coach that checks in regularly, even obviously beneficially sees you and can actually see whether, you know, if you say, yeah, I'm fine, whether that coincides with your body language, with your facial expression. You know, it's small indicators that could potentially tell something about the state of the athlete. And then, like you said, of course, there's nowadays we can track all sorts of different things. I mean, monitoring is becoming everything, but I think it's very much about finding that balance between those things that are fact, you know, and even there you have to be careful. You know, is an overnight heart rate or an overnight HRV, is that actually telling the full story? What is the difference between maybe overnight measures and a morning measure? I think Marco Altini does a good job in terms of educating when to use what, and what are the nuances that are provided by those metrics. And I think the athlete has to have an interest and an education, so to speak, in terms of learning how to interpret those signals. And sometimes you have to overturn signals, that's for sure. In a race, you're not going to stop just because it feels hard, but you have to learn when, for example, a pain is not good anymore. So these monitoring things, I think these include a variety of different factors, and that's also something that we at MRYA, we have a sort of a holistic assessment that we do, which is actually available for free on our website. So this includes it's a questionnaire about a variety of different things. So we have 5 categories. It's questions about training, health, recovery, environment, and nutrition. And that's something that you can repeat on a regular basis. Let's say it depends a bit on your state. Like if you're in an underperforming state, then you do it more frequently, let's say every 3 to 4 weeks. But even if you are in a good state, then we generally recommend that you do a submaximal test, whether that's on like a standard loop or on a treadmill with an incline, or a stationary bike, or whatever. It just has to be relatively standardized. You do that every 4 to 6 weeks, and then you could also fill that questionnaire, and that usually provides you with quite a good insurance system, so to speak.
So I'm hearing kind of two themes emerged to this question of how do we help keep athletes outside of this blurry range of stepping into overtraining or underperformance. The first component that you mentioned is actually quite interesting. It's this aspect of individualization. It goes back to coaching 101. And I can speak from my personal experience. I've probably consulted with maybe up to 30 athletes that are in some form of overtraining and underperformance, whether I got them there or another coach got them there, or however they got there. They come from many kind of different angles. But one of the common undercurrents amongst all those athletes that I can rack my memory right now and remember right off of the bat is that they had a training program that was not tailored to them specifically. It was either a static training program, it was either a program that was copy pasted from another athlete. It was a program that hadn't been individualized to the feedback that they were actually giving the coach. There's a whole different ways that you can unindividualize or not individualize a training program. It's not necessarily volume, right? Which is kind of the fallacy that we run into a lot. You just train a lot and then you're automatically going to be overtrained. One of the themes that are one of the more common undercurrents that I think that you're trying to allude to here is just have a program that's individualized to you, individualized to your strengths and weaknesses, how much volume you've done in the past, how successful that volume has been, the frequency of the training that you're doing, the frequency of the intensity that you're doing. Are you doing 2 workouts per week, 3 workouts per week? All of those, that milieu of workout characteristics that has been successful in the past can be a really great blueprint for the future. And then the second thing that you're mentioning is this monitoring component. And I'm going to leave a link in the show notes I've had Marco, since you mentioned him by name, I've had him on my podcast twice to discuss this very aspect. And you're absolutely correct. He does a brilliant job of explaining all the different nuances and applicability of not only heart rate variability, which is kind of his bread and butter, but a lot of the other monitors and wearables out there. But some component of monitoring that when I internalize it, it helps reinforce the individualization piece. None of those things are perfect and they can't stand alone. We're not going to get perfect red, yellow, green stoplight systems like we all kind of want to tell us if athletes are ready to train or not ready to train, or whether they should go hard or go easy. But we can do things that can help us, that can help the subjective side of things either confirm or deny or give us a better direction on where to actually take an athlete. Those are the two things that I'm kind of like hearing from you, that if athletes are ramping up their training, be mindful of what's worked for you and how much you've done in the past. Not that you shouldn't exceed it, but just be mindful of it. Like kind of like look at your previous training and has it been successful or not. And the second thing is just have some sort of feedback loop, whether that's a wearable that you use or a constellation of wearables or subjective feedback, or hopefully all of the above. Have something in place that serves as a little bit of a check and balance to make sure that the pathway that you're actually taking is going to be one that is continually sustainable for you.
Yeah, I can agree more. I think the word sustainability is also one that actually we emphasize a lot. I think, again, that long-term thinking in terms of what you can actually like, it always depends. Like if you have 6 weeks and after 6 weeks you're never gonna put a foot in a running shoe anymore, then maybe it's a different story, even though probably you still don't want to risk all your bones and your joints and all that. But it's a different story. But if you want to optimize for a very long time frame, I think sustainability has to be an aspect to consider. And I think it should also be a talking point in whoever you are working with. If you work with a coach, then sustainability, especially within your context of living, like whether you're working or whether you're studying or whether you're a professional athlete, is definitely something that has to be considered into creating a plan. And we are very much of the opinion that the athlete has a prominent role in that planning. Maybe not in the specific session prescription, but definitely in the adaptation of the plan or the adjustment of the plan, because you can be the best coach in the world, but and not even his or her training plan will be perfect, because you have to adapt it based on what's happening around. And yeah, that's where I think communication is really key, and that doesn't come natural to every athlete. And I think that's maybe also from a coaching perspective, where sometimes you have to figure out a little bit, how can you bring your athlete to communicate with you? Or maybe it's just not, chemistry is not there, and then maybe it's also better if this athlete works with someone else, or maybe works in a group where the coach sees the athlete every day. I think for me, at least, communication is definitely something that is crucial for everything. And an athlete has to be very much aware of this and learn how to know himself or herself better in terms of communication, or communicating to the coach or to the partner or to the whoever is involved in this athlete environment.
Okay, I wanted to check in with Coach Ryan again to discuss further this balance between objective feedback and subjective feedback, and how we can use the interplay between both of those to help monitor athletes. Ryan, what do you have to say about this topic?
Right. So I hit on earlier about the importance of a consistent, honest communication. That's the foundation of all of this. But we also have data, training peaks, interval workouts. How is their normalized grade pace trending throughout a block? And HRV is another one, specifically using the HRV for training, because it's been talked about on this podcast quite a bit that like it's the most valid measure, as opposed to the Garmin reading overnight or the Coros or whatever. But there's always caveats with data. And I'll give two examples here. So last year, I wanted to leverage HRV data more. I got the HRV for training coach account. I was encouraging my athletes to get the app, do the measurements in the morning, making sure they had the correct information on how to do those measurements correctly. And specifically, I wanted to use it with my high volume athletes, because naturally they can be closer to the edge of being cooked a little too much it's important to monitor when they need the recovery. And I wanted it for the historical data so I could look back and find the patterns of, hey, they responded really well to this load of training. This was a period of too many interval workouts that the numbers weren't looking great with their HRV. So athlete A, high volume athlete, loves to exercise, enthusiastic about all things. He's checking his HRV. Everything's like green. Green score is good and consistent for a while. And like 4, 6 weeks later, after we start this, I come to learn he's been rechecking his HRV till he gets the green score, till he gets the score he wants every morning. So
Gamifying the monitoring process.
Exactly. I have to hit the green so I can do those 20-hour weeks coaches put on the training plan. Because if I get a yellow, he's going to text me, he's going to take something away, and we can't have that. So naturally, that throws all that out of the window. And then another athlete, um, they were getting anxious upon their measurements in the morning because same thing, they didn't want to get a yellow or a red that would then kind of trigger this stoplight system that we had of, hey, if you get a yellow, text me and let's just see how everything's going. Okay, you're doing a bunch of interval workouts, not surprising. You had to stay up late last night with the kids, not surprising. Okay, we're getting 2 yellows. Let's investigate further and likely alter training. If we get a red, full stop, likely throw some recovery days in there, whatever. This athlete also loves exercising, has big goals. They don't want to see their training changed. And they were getting very anxious upon the measurements in the morning. Of course, that's going to throw off the readings. And so with these two examples, it just reminded me of what is the core of my coaching philosophy, that communication is so, so important. I wasn't throwing that out with these athletes. I was just thinking it would be another fail-safe, and back to that point earlier of, hey, this is more historical data to see how they're best responding and not responding to training. But with these two athletes, it was also a good reminder of don't just like implement these things, specifically like measuring the data and forget the communication piece, or like keep having oversight if like you're getting good, reliable data or not.
Yeah, our coaches will say our coaching group at CTS will say that we're not only coaching athletes with the physical prescription that we're actually giving them, go out and go run 2 hours on Wednesday and do a 5 hour long run on Saturday or whatever that physical prescription is, but we're also coaching them on how to be coached. And especially for newer athletes who this is the case with a lot of athletes that we see come in the doors, is their first foray into coaching. They kind of don't know what they don't know, right? They don't know how valuable the feedback is. They don't know how valuable the data is. They don't know how valuable just saying, man, I was really clumsy in the first 2 kilometers of the run or something like that. They don't know how valuable everything felt great. Those 3 words, right? Everything felt great, or today was a good day. Those simple pieces of feedback, they don't realize like how valuable that is when it's stacked up over periods of time and that feedback becomes kind of becomes consistent. But all of this, I still come back and view it through the lens of it is a way to individualize the training for a specific purpose. We have these general concepts of we can only increase volume to so much and by such a degree or whatever philosophy you actually want to use. The overriding theme across all of that is looking at a individual, Sophie, Koop, whoever, whoever we're actually working with. What do they actually need? How do they need to be? How do they need to communicate on a two-way street? What volume we're applying, what intensity we're applying, and things like that. And that's not easy. I want to get back to the sustainability piece and flip that on its head a little bit. Since this podcast is timely, we're getting into the meat and potatoes of the training season. One of the things that athletes are going to want to do is undertake a training camp, which is inherently an unsustainable component of training. They're going to go out, they're going to do some sort of race recon, some elite athletes will go do an altitude camp or a team camp or something like that, and intensify their training in some way. They either intensify it by doing more volume over a concentrated period of time. They either intensify it by doing a higher frequency of workouts, harder workouts. There's a number of different ways that you can slice and dice it. But the whole point of it is these training camps kind of offer like an isolated environment, so to speak. Remove them from their day-to-day environment, and they can increase what they would normally be able to do. And the hope is that will reap a superior adaptation as compared to the sustainable training that they do, week to week. And I'm wondering what your perspective on that particular component is, because many times, once again, if we talk about an overreaching or overtraining or underperforming athlete, you're seeing that you're part of that mixture of training that they're doing is how are these training camps constructed? So do you have any guideposts or guidelines for athletes that are undertaking these potential training camp opportunities in terms of how should they actually go about designing them, and what things should they take into consideration when doing so?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting and a complex question, because I think it depends very much on the athlete. It depends whether you're an elite athlete, where maybe a training camp isn't that much of a jump in terms of volume, compared to when an age group or an amateur athlete goes for a weekend away, even, or a week away, where the jump in training might be significantly more. And also the training environment, for an amateur, maybe they don't have to work, maybe they don't have their family around. Whereas for an elite athlete, maybe, their training environment is sort of optimized to a degree where even when they stay at home, it's relatively the same, whereas they can focus on their training entirely. So I think that obviously the context is important. And then I think training camps, like with training in general, I think Steven Seiler said that or tweeted it recently, that training is an optimization challenge and not a maximization challenge. And I think that goes for training camps as well. So it's not about trying to cram in as much training as possible in those whatever days you have available, and but actually trying to optimize something. And maybe that is to specify for something specifically. Maybe you have only 3 days, but over those 3 days, in terms of an ultra context, maybe you want to simulate your race over a 3-day period, or for an Ironman athlete, maybe you want to do the Ironman distance over a 2-day or a 3-day period, which is very specific. So you're trying to optimize something, but you're not necessarily trying to maximize for something. And I think that obviously that speaks to specificity. It doesn't necessarily speak to how we're going to adapt to that then as well, which is the other important piece for, optimizing versus maximizing, because the end goal obviously is adaptation. And I think that's where sort of the holy grail, we still don't have it. We don't have the training metric that we have to follow in terms of having a guarantee that we're going to perfectly adapt to the training that we're doing. And therefore, it's also very difficult to sometimes steer the load or to manage the load effectively for optimizing whatever goal we're setting. So I think from a practical perspective, what I think is always a good advice is that you shouldn't be needing another holiday after you're finishing your training camp. But it's fine if you're tired. It's fine to need a few days easy. I think getting out of your comfort zone is a good thing. It's even better if you can combine a training camp with actually having fun and having a good time around people. But yeah, there's a few, and I'm sure I'm not the first one that says that. Certain things in training camps are obviously not beneficial, which is, trying to lose weight at the same time, or trying to, go hard every single day, or combine it with excessive alcohol consumption in the evening, or going partying every single day. But I don't think that's a thing within your community. So I don't think I have to have to necessarily emphasize that here.
So the way that I frame it up, and athletes always want to do this because they want to, they in their mind, to use your vocabulary, they want to maximize something, and what they're trying to maximize is their time out on feet. But the way that I'm internalizing it is just the way that I think that you want other athletes and other coaches to internalize it. Is we're trying to optimize, and we might be trying to optimize for the end adaptation that we're trying to achieve. The framework that I like to use when setting this up is, if you're going to increase your work output by X, let's just say that's 2 hours a day, right? And that would be a double for a lot of athletes. Most athletes aren't training 2 hours, or most normal athletes aren't training 2 hours a day. Well, let's say we wanted to decrease it by 2 hours a day. You also need 2 hours a day to not train, an additional 2 hours a day to not train. So not only are you allocating an extra 2 hours a day for the actual training component, you're allocating an additional time of 1x on top of that to just not do anything. So be prepared to double whatever the increase in training actually is throughout the day in order to get the benefits from it, because you also have to rest more. And that's where this all kind of like comes down to it. I can always ask an athlete to, instead of waking up at 5 a.m, wake up at 3 a.m to get an extra 2 hours. But that's not going to benefit them nearly as much as having the extra 2 hours of time availability to go and train, and then have another 2 hours of availability on top of that to not do anything and just rest and absorb the training. So I think the first thing when we start to design these training camps for athletes is start to think about the whole picture of time and where all of that time is getting allocated. Am I traveling? Am I having to do a transport from A to B in order to do like a point to point or a recon or something like that? The training activity is going to take X. And then I'm also allocating some amount of time for nothing. Like, block it off in your calendar. Make sure you're, taking as few work things as possible, if any of those. Decompress as much as possible. I do think that, like, when we talk about in terms of reducing the risk for a training camp to be part of the over or under negative part of the equation, baking in the recovery side of it as an intentional part of it is a big part of it all, because a lot of times we can find the time availability, but what we fail to do is to find the time availability on the recovery side.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's also something that maybe people do not always appreciate, that actually elite athletes spend a lot of time more, a lot of their time that they have available more on recovery. They take naps every single day, which I think is a huge performance enhancer. And also, oftentimes their logistics are optimized. Oftentimes they live in a place where they don't have to travel that many minutes or hours to a pool, for instance, or to a place where they can actually do their hill reps or their long runs on the trails and all that kind of stuff. But for some, obviously, and that's also like, if you take triathletes, that's why they go to resorts where they have the pool and the gym and the track in one place, and that can sometimes be extremely beneficial, simply because you spend, or you save that time going from one infrastructure to the other, or from one place to the other. Another factor I think that I haven't mentioned before is obviously nutrition. I think if you do increase the training load, it's always a very good idea to be on top of nutrition, rather taking too much than too little. It's a great time and place as well to experiment with your race nutrition, where hopefully you'll fuel enough as well. And also, like, don't don't spare with the protein, because I think in terms of adaptation, that's where, for example, having a protein shake before going to bed can sometimes be extremely beneficial, simply because our output is so much higher and we need it for recovery.
100%. Okay, I wanted to check in with Coach Ryan one final time to talk about how we build in extra recovery for high volume athletes or for athletes who are increasing their whole training load.
Earlier in this podcast, or perhaps after this little snippet, you or the guest mentions this concept of, hey, if I'm going to add 2 hours of training above their mean, I would like them to have 2 hours of nothing, air quotes, on the other side of that. And that's just a logical way of looking at it of, if I increase load to absorb that load, get the most benefit from it, I've got to have a balance of recovery on the other side. So how do we get to this to find that right load? Goes back to that principle of communication and feedback. Look through their historical data in terms of when they hit this level of volume, they kind of crashed and burned. When we were doing 3 interval workouts in the course of 10 days, it was too much. Like, we're trying to use the data that way and then couple that with their subjective feedback as well. And how I approach this with athletes, if let's call it moderate stress, in which they're not necessarily time crunched, their work stress, their life stress is not excessive. Typically, a 4-day recovery block will do the trick. 1 rest day, 3 recovery runs, 45, 60 minutes. That's pretty straightforward. Everybody gets that. I don't care if they're doing 15 hours a week, 8 hours a week. That's standard. 9 times out of 10 works really well. If I'm going to categorize a high stressed athlete, they're time crunched. It's this scenario of, like, I've got to plan my schedule down to the minute to fit in my run and then go pick up the kids from practice and everything. With those, they're already so close to the edge. I just give them a full week recovery block. Like, throw in 2 rest days in there, 3 recovery runs, that 45, 60-minute duration, and a couple of endurance runs. Because they're already so close to the edge of being overstressed. Like, again, going back to that principle of, we got to have nothing on the other side of that. But yeah, those are like 2 basic ways I approach the recovery. And the whole theme of this episode, consistent, honest communication, whether you're self-coached or you are coached. I think that's an important thing to hit on. The self-coach athlete can still do this, whether it's leaving comments that are private to themselves in Strava. You can do that. If you have a Training Peaks account, you can leave your feedback in there. And again, if it's consistent, you can go out and tease when you're thriving and when, oopsies, I crashed and burned. Felt like I needed 2 weeks off or whatever.
So I want to leave the listeners with a little bit of a summary of some of the monitoring that you were talking about earlier. I'm going to link up in the show notes a blog that you recently wrote with some of the previous podcast guests that, now that I'm looking at the author list here, so the previous podcast guests that I've had on here, and and the title of it is an athlete's career insurance. I love that title, by the way. Implementing of monitoring tools to prevent underperformance in sport. And insurance is the best way to put it, because you can't completely prevent it, but you want to put systems in place to mitigate the risk as much as possible. And that's what a insurance policy, is ultimately like set up to do, is to try to mitigate mitigate things that could actually kind of go awry. You have this 5-pronged approach of monitoring tools, and in order of the chart that's in the blog, it's training diary, physiological tests, resting heart rate and heart rate variability, psychological questionnaire, and medical health controls. We're not going to be able to go through every single one of those components. That would take, five podcasts. But I'm wondering if you can kind of leave the listeners with a workflow, so to speak, of how to actually use that in practice from a day-to-day perspective, week-to-week perspective, and when they would see things that would cause them to titrate their workouts up, and then the opposite when they start seeing things that could cause their workouts to titrate down, and the things that they should be taking into consideration as they're actually using some of these monitoring tools.
Yeah, I think maybe as a first comment, it depends obviously a bit how much time you want to invest in all that. It might be that if you're not a professional athlete, you're only tracking your heart rate, for example, and then you have one parameter that you're going to track, and that's fine as well. Then you just have to be really really mindful, for example, to your heart rate and your RPE. And sometimes actually can be beneficial to focus on less parameters versus more. But in the end, it's we are big proponents of just having a selected or a handful of parameters that you track on a regular basis, and whether that happens on in an Excel sheet or in Training Peaks or in a journal, it doesn't really matter. Obviously, it depends a bit whether you self-coach or you work with a coach. Because if you work with a coach, then I think a digital training diary is obviously a good way to, as a conversation starter, right? Especially if you add comments, we would always recommend to add comments, like you said before. Even something very, very short can be a good feedback for the coach. Just everything is fine. So, there's no problem. I think for elite athletes, or also if an athlete is struggling, I think very frequent check-ins are extremely valuable. Just not just for a recovery, from a recovery perspective, but just simply if you're not well, I think it makes you feel good if I ask how you are every single day, or maybe not how are you, just like in a standardized way, but like how are you today? Is it a little bit better than yesterday? I think it makes a difference. And so these are things deviating slightly from, let's say, those 5 components. But I think the training diary is really maybe the most important tool that you have. And then it's very much it depends very much on, how much time do you want to allocate to it? How many variables are you actually tracking? I think it is a very good idea to include subjective factors such as motivation, mood, maybe things that you're not directly relating to training, but can often tell a lot about where you're at. I think maybe your partner or your spouse is also a good reference point for that. Just someone that holds up the mirror. If you're not reflective enough to judge whether you're in a good mood, or have I been? Have I been more irritable? How have I been sleeping? All these kind of things. Libido, like I said before. I think these are things that actually tell us a lot, even though that's sometimes not maybe not so comfortable to really dig into. Resting heart rate and HRV, I think, are great tools just to track, let's say, passively. And also for a coach, maybe like if you see changes there, it's always a good thing to have it. If you see something is completely out the norm for a longer time period, I think one-off readings are not normally a reason for concern. But if it's something that is changing for a longer time period, is something that could indicate certain things. But context is always king, right? I think, for example, now we have allergy season, so this could have an impact on HRV for sure. If you're a woman, I mean, in luteal phase, usually your resting heart rate is just higher, your HRV is lower, your sleep score is lower. It's just something that you have to know, and you can add context, and then it's usually less of a concern. But yeah, like I said, if you're a coach, then having an eye on that and rather ask once more than once less is usually beneficial, but also from an athlete perspective, giving more information is usually better than giving less information. Yeah, and then psychological questionnaires is something that if you really feel susceptible to like a lot of changes or in your mood state, then that's something that you can add. It's not something that is necessary from my perspective to do like for anyone, for everyone. Yeah, and medical checks, I think that's just something that is sensible to do once a year or depending on like when you go to before you go to altitude. I think it's definitely sensible to check your iron status, for example, and just make sure that you're healthy on a regular basis is usually a smart idea.
Out of all of these, though, is it fair to say that the training log or the training diary is the hero component of it? Because you started out with that and then kind of breezed through the rest of them, but either because it's a more consistent measure or whether it kind of like it can like alchemize both the performance side of it as well as the subjective component of it. Do you feel that if athletes are to focus on anything, is that where you would steer people towards?
Yeah, without a doubt. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I
and
haven't
that's
mentioned sorry, like I haven't mentioned the testing. Like I have mentioned it before. I think it's something that we usually do on a regular basis, like every 4 to 6 weeks. And I think most athletes have some sort of standardized sessions in their program where like you can see a little bit like how you're developing. And again, that's not like it's not a competition, it's not I'm gonna have to win this session. It's not a pass fail. It's more of like a little bit where you're at. And if you do that over a long period of time, especially like um, taking cross country skiers again as an example, like they have different periods in the year. Like, summer is usually preparation phase. So you do a test when you start your training. So maybe you have 10 years of data where every single year you test in the beginning of June, and you can also see the long-term development. And then, but also maybe you're panicking because you feel so unfit. But actually, if you can compare it to 10 years of data, you can add a bit of context to that. You can see like, look, actually, I was even more unfit 3 years ago, but then I had a great season. So I think it just gives you a little bit more confidence in what you're actually doing. And obviously, it's also very helpful for planning the training process and managing the training process as a coach.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head on why the training diary or the workout log can really be the hero is because you have more data points. You have data points every single day. And then if you want to take just the critical workouts, you've got 2 to 3 data points a week. And if you're consistently evaluating those week after week, month after month, year after year, not to say you don't like the physiological testing loses its starts to lose its cost benefit analysis the more you analyze the training, because the training just kind of gives you the best snapshot of where you're at because it's so consistent. The physiological test, although you get more accurate, standardized test, whatever it is, it's still a snapshot of one single moment in time during that one particular day. And so for the athletes out there, if you wanted to boil down this whole podcast into something like really, really simple, keep track of your training and evaluate your training on a day-to-day basis. You don't have to get as sophisticated as looking at all the artificial intelligence that like comes out of the data or anything like that. Just what did you do? How much of it? And how did you feel? It really doesn't get any more complicated than that.
Yeah, exactly. Couldn't agree more.
Well, Sophie, this has been great. Before we go, will you let the athletes know a little bit more about like where they can find more about you, more about MRYA, more about the work that you guys are doing?
Yeah, so I think you will add the website. So I think usually it's best to just visit the website. We have I think quite some interesting articles there. They're all for your educational purposes. So they're for free. We are also on social media platforms, Instagram, LinkedIn, and X. And so you can fill if you're dealing with or if you don't know whether you're of risk of underperformance. So it's a risk assessment. It's not a diagnosis. We have an assessment of your risk of underperformance on our website, which you can also fill in for free. And if you fill that, then it is up to you whether you want a consultation with us. We also work with organizations and teams. So if you're part of an organization or part of a team or a federation which is interested to prevent underperformance, or even if you're part of a corporate organization and you think actually, things like, we haven't talked about allostatic load, but like if you're affected by burnout or underperforming employees, you're just like work-life balance is skewed towards the load, the overload side, then I think that's also something where we can help with implementing systems that can recognize or ideally prevent that in the first place.
That's excellent. I will have links to all that in the show notes. Sophie, thank you for your time, and more importantly, thank you for the work that you do with athletes.
Thank you very much, Jason.
All right, folks. There you have it. There you go. Much thanks to Sophie and Coach Ryan for coming on the podcast today and helping us try to understand this sometimes mysterious aspect of underperformance syndrome, overtraining, whatever you want to call it. It's been known by those names as well as many more over the course of my coaching career. And it's something that we are always constantly keeping tabs on as coaches and as athletes. And as we discussed during the podcast, there are a number of both communication as well as technological tools that we have used to try to get a fix on this problem. And what I have found throughout the course of my coaching career is there is no one silver bullet. You have to really alchemize all of those to make correct decisions on how much training load is enough, where you might be actually stepping over the line, and then course corrective measures to use when you think you have actually stepped over that line. All right, folks, as always, this podcast is brought to you without any advertisers or sponsors in any way, shape, or form. There's no discount codes or anything like that you will ever hear on this podcast. Is something that I'm very proud of and something that I have been insistent on ever since the inception of this podcast. So if you want to help support this podcast, all you have to do is go to my website, jasonkoop.com, and subscribe to Research Essentials for Ultrarunning. We take scientific topics like the one that we talked about today, and we break them down into much greater detail. We've had a lot of coaches and high-level athletes be subscribers of that content, and they all absolutely love it. I get a lot out of producing that content each and every single month with my contributors and co-authors, Professor Nick Tiller, PhD, and Stephanie Howe, PhD, where we break down the latest science and research as it relates to ultrarunning. All this starts at the measly price of $9.99 a month. It's a pretty darn good investment for high quality content. You'll go check that out. The links to that are in the show notes. And that is it for today, folks. We're going to come back next week with another killer episode. But until then, I will see you all out on the trails.